The bells of London rang for weeks after the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. Britain had conquered an empire stretching from Bengal to Barbados, from Canada to the Caribbean. Yet victory brought burdens heavier than any triumphal arch. The war had doubled Britain's national debt to a staggering £140 million. Prime Minister George Grenville turned his eyes westward across the Atlantic. The American colonies had grown fat on trade protected by British ships and British blood. Surely, Parliament reasoned, these prosperous subjects could help bear the costs of their own defence. The Stamp Act of 1765 was meant to be simple: taxes on legal documents, newspapers, playing cards. But the colonists saw something more sinister than ink on paper. No taxation without representation became their cry. Samuel Adams stirred the crowds with words that cut like winter wind. When Parliament sent troops to keep order, the streets grew colder still. The Boston Massacre of 1770 left 5 dead on King Street. The Tea Act of 1773 seemed the final insult. On a bitter December night, 342 chests of tea vanished into Boston Harbor's black water. Samuel Adams watched from the wharf as the Sons of Liberty made their stand. Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, closing Boston's port until the tea was paid for. In Williamsburg, Thomas Jefferson penned resolves that spoke of natural rights and tyranny. The First Continental Congress convened in Carpenter's Hall in September 1774. King George III, 22 years old and stubborn as granite, declared the colonies in open rebellion. "The die is now cast," he told his ministers. "The colonists must either triumph or submit." On Lexington Green that April morning, the world held its breath. A single shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. 8 colonial farmers fell where they stood. By sunset, the British were fighting for their lives on the road back to Boston. The war that would create a nation had begun. Neither side had asked for this war, yet neither could turn back now. The bonds of affection had finally snapped. 18 April 1775. The city held its breath. Paul Revere polished the last buckle on his riding boots and listened for the signal. 2 lanterns. The British were crossing the Charles by boat. He leapt into the saddle, spurs striking sparks. William Dawes took the longer southern road. Together they carried the warning that would rouse 10,000 muskets. Dawn found 77 minute men under Captain John Parker forming a ragged line. Most were farmers, some were boys. Major John Pitcairn's light infantry marched onto the green with the precision of empire. "Stand your ground, but don't fire unless fired upon," Parker told them. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a single musket cracked, its owner never identified. The answering volley tore through the colonial line. 8 colonists lay dead, 10 more wounded. Pitcairn pressed on to Concord, 6 miles west. There, emboldened farmers waited behind stone walls and tree trunks. When the regulars fired again, the Americans shot back, this time with fury. The march back to Boston became a running nightmare. Every hill and hedge spat fire. By nightfall, 15,000 New England volunteers ringed Boston. A siege was born. News galloped south to Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress convened in stunned silence. On 15 June, they chose George Washington, Virginia planter, veteran of the French and Indian War, to lead this sudden army. He rode north through summer heat. Every mile brought more volunteers: farmers, clerks, coopers, and dreamers. At Cambridge, he found not an army but a mob with muskets. He would have to forge them into soldiers. Across the water, General Thomas Gage waited behind cannon and warships. Neither side yet grasped the magnitude of what had begun. But the shot heard round the world had already crossed the Atlantic. Within weeks, Parliament declared the colonies in open rebellion. King George III vowed to crush the revolt. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson listened to the wind and wondered if independence was now inevitable. Benjamin Franklin, still in London, felt the last bridges burn. John Adams told Congress the time for conciliation had passed. The war that would create a nation had begun. June the 17th, 1775. The night air hung thick with salt and tension as colonial farmers, merchants, and tradesmen clawed at the earth with shovels and pickaxes. They had marched from Cambridge in silence, following Colonel William Prescott's orders to fortify this hill before sunrise. By first light, British lookouts spotted the impossible: earthworks where none had existed hours before. General Thomas Gage could not believe his spyglass. Those rebellious colonials had dared to fortify the very hills overlooking his harbour. General William Howe, fresh from England, saw his chance for glory. He would lead 2,500 of Britain's finest uphill in perfect parade formation. The same tactics that had conquered continents would crush this colonial rebellion. The colonials watched from their hastily built redoubt, many seeing battle for the first time. When the British advanced, the silence was deafening. Then came the order: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The first volley cut down entire British ranks. Howe's men reformed and advanced again. Again, colonial fire tore through their lines. On the third assault, bayonets finally prevailed, but at horrific cost. Over 1,000 British casualties littered the hillside. General Henry Clinton, watching from Boston, reportedly muttered, "A few more such victories would ruin the British Army." 3 weeks later, George Washington arrived from Philadelphia. What he found appalled him: an army without discipline, soldiers wandering between camps, no standardized training. His diary recorded despair at the loose and disorderly state of his command. Yet beneath the chaos, Washington sensed something remarkable. These farmers and shopkeepers had stood against the world's finest army and made them pay dearly. The siege of Boston became a strange stalemate, neither side willing to risk another Bunker Hill. Across the Atlantic, King George III signed the Prohibitory Act. The colonies were now outside royal protection, officially foreign enemies. No more half measures. This was total war. January 1776 brought Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense. Within 3 months, 120,000 copies spread through the colonies. Paine's words were incendiary. "Of more worth is one honest man to society than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived." By spring, independence was no longer whispered. It was shouted in taverns and coffee houses. From New Hampshire to Georgia, the question changed from should we to when. The siege lines around Boston became the crucible where a nation would be born. The stifling heat of July pressed down on Philadelphia like a wool blanket, turning the State House into a furnace of revolution. Inside, delegates wiped sweat from their brows as they debated Richard Henry Lee's bold resolution that these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Thomas Jefferson, 33 years old and notoriously quiet, sat apart from the others with his portable writing box. He borrowed words from Locke and Montesquieu, crafting arguments that would echo through centuries. John Adams championed the young Virginian's words with characteristic fervor, while Benjamin Franklin used his gentle wit to calm the fractious delegates. On the 4th day of July, 1776, 56 men signed their names to a death warrant. The Declaration of Independence was treason, pure and simple, punishable by hanging until dead. But the euphoria of independence collided with harsh reality that summer. General William Howe's massive armada arrived in New York Harbor, 400 ships carrying 32,000 of the finest troops in Europe. Washington positioned his 16,000 men across the East River, but it wasn't enough. On August 27th, Howe struck like a hammer. The Americans fought bravely but were outflanked, outmaneuvered, outclassed. September brought fresh humiliation at Kip's Bay. Washington watched from a hilltop as his militia fled at the first sight of the enemy. He drew his sword and rode among them, shouting until his voice cracked, but the rout was complete. November delivered the cruelest blow of all. Fort Washington fell with 2,800 Americans captured, the largest surrender of the war. Washington watched from across the river at Fort Lee, powerless to help. Morale plummeted to depths unseen. Men deserted by the hundreds. Thomas Paine, marching with the army, wrote by firelight, "These are the times that try men's souls." But Washington refused to surrender to despair. On Christmas night, 1776, he gathered his remaining 2,400 men. The crossing began at 11 o'clock, sleet cutting like knives, ice choking the river. By 4 in the morning, they reached the Jersey shore. They marched 9 miles through the storm to reach Trenton. The Hessians, celebrating Christmas, were caught completely by surprise. The victory was complete. 900 prisoners, crucial supplies, and most importantly, hope restored. The ragtag army staggered into winter quarters at Morristown, having proved they could strike back. Across the Atlantic, French ministers began studying maps with new interest. The Revolution had found its second wind. The winter of 1777 melted into spring, and across the Canadian frontier, a glittering host prepared to march. General John Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny for his love of theatre and champagne, unfurled a grandiose plan. He would lead nearly 8,000 regulars, Hessians, Loyalists, and Canadian militia south along Lake Champlain, seize Fort Ticonderoga, slice through the Hudson River Valley, and cut New England off from the rebellious Middle Colonies. King George III personally approved the plan, convinced it would end the war by Christmas. Yet the wilderness had other ideas. Rains turned roads to swamps, bridges collapsed, supply lines stretched thin, and patriot militia lurked behind every tree. By early September, Burgoyne's army crawled past Saratoga, exhausted, hungry, and still more than 20 miles from Albany. Across the field, American General Horatio Gates had gathered 9,000 Continentals and militia behind strong earthworks on Bemis Heights. On September 19th, Burgoyne lunged. At Freeman's Farm, Benedict Arnold, still the hero of Ticonderoga, led a reckless countercharge that shattered British grenadiers. Night fell without decision, but the British had lost 600 men they could not replace. For 18 days, both armies stared at each other through drifting autumn fog. Burgoyne waited for help from General Howe in New York that never came. On October 7th, he tried again. Arnold, now quarreling with Gates, defied orders and led a wild assault on the British left. A ball shattered his leg, yet the Americans swept forward, capturing 2 key redoubts. Burgoyne pulled back to Saratoga village, hemmed in by converging Patriot columns. On October 17th, 1777, Gentleman Johnny surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. The band played Yankee Doodle as the defeated column marched out between silent American ranks. Across the Atlantic, the news reached Versailles like wildfire. Benjamin Franklin, already charming Parisian salons, seized the moment. On February 6, 1778, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance. Ships, soldiers, and gold began crossing the Atlantic. Spain and the Netherlands soon joined the fray, stretching British resources across the globe. Meanwhile, at Valley Forge, Washington's army faced a different kind of war. Men wrapped their feet in rags and left bloody footprints in the snow. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian volunteer, arrived speaking little English but wielding relentless drill. He cursed in 3 languages, then demonstrated each maneuver himself. By spring, farmers had become soldiers who could march, load, and fire like professionals. At Washington's side, a 19-year-old French nobleman arrived full of idealism. Lafayette became the general's adopted son, the living bridge between two continents. The world had turned. The Widening War began its southern turn on a chill December morning of 1778. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell led 2,500 men against the Georgia port, brushing aside the local militia in a swift, brutal assault. Within days, the British flag flew above the elegant squares of Savannah, and the first southern domino had fallen. King George's ministers now aimed to roll the rebellion up from the bottom, counting on the rumored thousands of loyalists in the Carolinas to rise once regular troops appeared. General Henry Clinton dispatched a second expedition from New York, and in the spring of 1780, a mighty armada, 90 transports escorted by men of war, steered toward Charleston. Charleston's defenders watched from ramparts of palmetto logs as the British closed the ring. After a 6-week siege, on the 12th of May, 1780, Major General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered the city and more than 5,000 Continental soldiers, the worst American loss of the entire war. South Carolina, it seemed, had collapsed. Into this shattered theater stepped 32-year-old Lieutenant General Charles Earl Cornwallis, slim, sandy-haired, confident that one more push would finish the rebellion. He marched inland toward Camden, brushing aside a hastily gathered American army under Horatio Gates. Gates himself fled the field so fast that legend claims he covered 180 miles in 3 days. The Southern cause lay bleeding, yet the very size of British success began to kindle resistance. From the flooded rice country emerged Francis Marion, small, wiry, already nicknamed the Swamp Fox, who struck at supply wagons and patrols, then vanished into black water mazes no redcoat map had ever charted. Across the Piedmont, Thomas Sumter's partisans thundered down from forest ridges to ambush convoys, then melted back into the green hills. Washington, still holding the fragile Northern Army together, sent his best remaining generals south. Greene understood that he could not win set battles, yet he could make Cornwallis lose the countryside. He divided his meager force, sending Daniel Morgan westward and keeping the rest mobile, forcing the British to chase shadows while their supply lines stretched thin as wire. In the north, the alliance forged at Saratoga finally bore fruit. Count Rochambeau landed at Newport with 4,000 veteran troops and heavy siege guns, and Washington met him amid fields of blooming lilies along the Hudson. Together they planned a joint stroke, but where? New York's defenses bristled like a hedgehog, and Clinton's army still held the city in iron grip. Then came the thunderbolt of treason. Benedict Arnold, hero of Saratoga, victor of Lake Champlain, now commander of West Point, opened secret negotiations to sell the fortress for £20,000 sterling and a British brigadier's commission. The plot unraveled only when Major John Andre was captured with incriminating papers hidden in his boot. Arnold fled to the Vulture sloop of war, leaving his name to become a byword for betrayal. Yet the cause endured. In the Chesapeake, a French admiral named François-Joseph Paul de Grasse weighed anchor from Cap Français with 28 ships of the line and 3,000 troops bound for North America. His message to Washington was simple: I will remain in American waters until mid-October. Strike where you will. Washington seized the fleeting chance. He spread false rumors of an assault on New York, ordered ovens built on Staten Island to bake bread for phantom battalions, and then, on the 19th of August 1781, slipped away southward with 4,000 French and 2,000 American soldiers. They covered 400 miles in 19 days, ferried across the Delaware and the Susquehanna, past fields of ripening corn and villages where silent crowds watched the armies pass like ghosts in the night. By the 10th of September, Washington stood on the banks of the York River, staring across at Cornwallis's encampment at Yorktown. Behind him, Rochambeau's siege guns lumbered into place. Out on the horizon, the topsails of de Grasse's fleet blotted the sea. The trap was set. The war that had begun with scattered musket fire on a village green was about to end beneath the guns of two nations on a quiet Virginia peninsula where tobacco once grew. September 28th, 1781. The noose tightened. Admiral de Grasse's fleet of 24 ships of the line rode at anchor in the mouth of the Chesapeake, their gun ports yawning like black teeth. Cornwallis could not flee by sea. Washington, Rochambeau, and Lafayette had marched south from New York with 7,000 Continentals and 8,000 French regulars, stealing across the land like a ghost army. Now, 16,000 Allied soldiers ringed Yorktown in a silent siege. The first parallel opened on the night of October 6th. By lantern light, engineers laid out the trench lines with white tape, stakes, and plummets. Soldiers worked with muffled tools, speaking only in whispers. By dawn, a zigzag of earthworks stretched 400 yards closer to the British outer defenses. The French artillery opened on October 9th. The bombardment never ceased. Shells arced across the sky in graceful parabolas, bursting in red flashes above the British earthworks. One American officer wrote that the French gunners fired with a precision and fury that seemed almost supernatural. Day by day, the parallels crept closer. On October 11th, engineers began a second parallel only 300 yards from redoubts 9 and 10. The British replied with cannon and rifle fire, but the earthworks advanced like a living thing. Cornwallis knew the end approached. On the night of October 14th, Washington ordered the assault on the redoubts. Lafayette commanded the American light infantry against Redoubt 10. French grenadiers under Colonel William Durpont attacked Redoubt 9. At 8 o'clock, the columns advanced. They moved with unloaded muskets, relying on cold steel alone. In just 10 minutes, both redoubts fell. The final parallel now pressed within pistol shot of the British lines. Cornwallis attempted escape across the York River on the night of October 16th. A sudden squall scattered the boats. Many soldiers drowned. The general returned, defeated by nature itself. By dawn on October 19th, the British position was hopeless. At 2 o'clock, the British drums beat the signal to surrender. The tune was "The World Turned Upside Down." Washington sat his horse at the head of the Allied line, his face grave and composed. Cornwallis, pleading illness, sent his deputy, General O'Hara, to offer his sword. O'Hara first tried to present the sword to Rochambeau, who pointed to Washington. Washington indicated his second in command, General Benjamin Lincoln. 8,000 British soldiers marched out between two silent lines of allies, their colors cased. They laid down their arms on a small table covered in green baize. The red flag above Yorktown slowly descended. In London, when news reached Lord North, he cried out, "Oh God, it is all over." Parliament voted to end the war. Though scattered skirmishes would continue for 2 more years, Yorktown had decided the fate of an empire. The war that began with scattered musket fire on a village green had ended beneath the guns of 2 nations. A new nation had been born in fire and smoke, and the world would never be the same. The smoke of Yorktown had barely settled when the world began to change. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin, his long grey hair unpowdered and his spectacles perched on his nose, sat beneath a portrait of Louis XVI, negotiating not just peace, but the birth of a nation. John Adams arrived from Amsterdam, his boots still muddy from Dutch canals, demanding the Mississippi as western boundary and Newfoundland fishing rights for American crews. John Jay, quiet and precise, insisted that America negotiate directly with London, not through French intermediaries. For months they argued, bargained, threatened, and compromised. Finally, on September 3, 1783, beneath the painted ceiling of David Hartley's Paris mansion, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The document was simple, yet revolutionary. His Britannic Majesty acknowledged the United States, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to be free, sovereign, and independent states. At Newburgh, Washington faced his greatest challenge, not British bayonets, but the temptation of power. When a letter proposed making him king, he crushed it. On December 23, 1783, in the Maryland State House at Annapolis, Washington did what no victorious general had done in 2,000 years. Before the Continental Congress, he surrendered his commission. He became, in that moment, the Cincinnatus of the New World. Across the 13 states, demobilized soldiers returned to farms and workshops. They carried more than muskets. They carried ideas. In Virginia, a young veteran named James Madison listened to former soldiers demand equal representation. In Massachusetts, Daniel Shays led farmers against debt courts. The Articles of Confederation designed for war proved inadequate for peace. Each state printed its own money, raised its own tariffs, ignored federal treaties. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, but the Revolution followed him home. The ideals of liberty and equality, proclaimed in 1776, began to challenge the institution of slavery itself. In 1787, delegates gathered again in Philadelphia. Through the long summer, they hammered out a new constitution, federal yet national, strong yet restrained. When news reached Europe, France exploded in revolution. Haiti rose next, then Latin America. The American Revolution had become a contagion of liberty. 2 centuries later, in Selma and Birmingham, in Prague and Tiananmen Square, the same words echoed. The war that began on Lexington Green never truly ended. It continues wherever people demand that government derive its just powers from the consent of the governed. From 8 years of fire and 8 decades of struggle, a nation was not merely created, but continuously remade.